The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving Portland wrapped in a thin mist that clung to the streets like memory. Julia Dawson stood by the kitchen window of her small apartment, watching droplets slide down the glass. At 34, she had learned to make peace with silence. It wasn't always this way. Once, she believed life would unfold like the stories she grew up reading. A warm home, a husband who adored her, a family built on trust. That dream began when she was barely more than a girl. At 18, Julia had fallen in love with Mark Dawson, a man a few years older who promised the world and handed her fragments. They married quickly with more hope than sense, and she believed they would figure things out together. But life had other plans. Those first months were a blur of second-hand furniture and shared dreams whispered into the dark. Then came the pregnancy, unexpected but welcomed, and with it a shift in everything. Mark announced he needed to leave town for work. "It's the only way to give our son a future," he'd said, kissing her forehead before disappearing for weeks. He wrote occasionally, claimed he was saving money, but no money ever came. Instead, there were excuses. A stolen wallet, a crooked boss, bad luck. Each time, Julia wanted to believe him. Each time, she swallowed the rising knot of fear that maybe she had married a man who wasn't coming back, at least not the way she hoped. When he did return, it wasn't with the warmth of a husband who missed his family. He was angry, suspicious, quick to accuse her of things she hadn't done. He blamed her for tying him down, for ruining his chances at a better life, for trapping him with a child. And when words stopped being enough, his hands spoke instead. The first slap shocked her into silence. The second taught her that silence wouldn't save her. By the time he raised his hand again, Julia had already decided she was leaving. One cold October night, after another screaming match ended with bruises blooming on her arms, Julia wrapped her sleeping son Ethan in a blanket, slipped on the first pair of shoes she could find, and stepped into the darkness. She didn't pack clothes or toys. There was no plan, no destination, just a desperate need to get away before he broke more than her body. She spent that night on a friend's couch, her heart pounding at every sound in the hallway, afraid Mark might come looking. He didn't. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he thought she'd crawl back like before. She never did. Julia's parents took her and Ethan in without questions. Her father simply hugged her and said, "You should have left sooner." Her mother cooked soup and tucked Ethan into bed while Julia slept for the first time in months without fear. Yet safety didn't mean ease. There were 3 adults and a toddler squeezed into a 2-bedroom house. Bills piled up. Julia, with no degree and little work experience, took whatever job she could, cashier shifts, cleaning offices, stocking shelves at night. There were nights when dinner was bread and soup, when she cut back on meals so Ethan could have more. But even in the exhaustion, there was a quiet strength growing inside her. She spent long hours after Ethan fell asleep staring at the ceiling, thinking about what kind of life she wanted for them. She no longer dreamed of fairy tales. She dreamed of stability, of a small apartment they could call their own, of shoes Ethan wouldn't outgrow before she could afford another pair, of mornings that didn't begin with fear. Slowly, painfully, she began to build that life. It started with a part-time job at a small florist shop. Flowers had always calmed her, their quiet resilience mirroring her own. Her boss noticed her dedication and soon offered her full-time hours. The bruises faded, but the memory of them remained, shaping her resolve. Julia wasn't naive anymore. She understood now that love wasn't enough to save a marriage and that promises without action were just empty air. Most of all, she knew that no one was coming to rescue her. She would have to rescue herself. Standing at the kitchen window all those years later, watching the mist drift across the city she now called home, Julia Dawson felt something stir inside her that had been gone for a long time. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the beginning of it, the fragile, stubborn spark of a life rebuilt from nothing. By the time Ethan turned 4, the chaos of Julia's early 20s had settled into something steadier, if not exactly easy. Life was still a patchwork of double shifts and second-hand furniture, but their little apartment above the florist shop smelled like lavender and sunlight, and laughter returned to their evenings. It was during this quiet, cautious chapter that Brian Cole entered her life. He wasn't the whirlwind Mark had been. There were no grand promises or passionate declarations. Brian was gentle, soft-spoken, and seemed to understand the bruises life had left on her heart. He listened more than he spoke, brought Ethan little toy cars on weekends, and told Julia that she deserved a man who would never raise his voice at her. After everything she had endured, his calm felt like a refuge. They met at a neighborhood bookstore on a rainy afternoon. Julia was helping Ethan pick out picture books when Brian struck up a conversation about gardening. He was a freelance graphic designer, he explained, someone who valued a slower pace. At first, that sounded like a dream. Julia was exhausted from running at full speed just to keep life afloat. Brian's pace was steady, comforting, like a pause she didn't know she needed. Their coffee dates turned into dinners, dinners into weekends spent together. Within a year, Brian moved into her apartment, and for a while, Julia believed this might finally be the love story she'd been waiting for. But as months blurred into seasons, that comforting slowness began to reveal its shadow. Brian didn't just prefer a slower pace, he seemed allergic to ambition. He took on small projects here and there, but never stuck with anything long enough to bring in steady income. When the rent was due or Ethan needed new shoes, Julia's paycheck was the one that covered it. She told herself it was temporary, that he was still finding his footing. She had, after all, once believed in second chances. Still, the imbalance grew harder to ignore. Julia would return from 12-hour shifts at the shop to find Brian scrolling on his laptop, promising that work was just around the corner. When she gently asked about applying for more clients or looking for part-time work, he would bristle. "You think I'm lazy?" he'd snap, wounded. "I'm trying. I just don't have the same luck you do." The arguments never turned cruel, but they chipped away at something fragile between them, the belief that they were a team. After a year of living together, Julia finally spoke the words she'd been rehearsing in her head for weeks. One evening after dinner, with Ethan asleep in his room, she sat across from Brian and told him they needed to talk about money, about responsibility. She told him she didn't expect wealth, just effort, a sign that he was building a life with her instead of leaning on the one she was already building alone. Brian's face changed as she spoke, shifting from surprise to offense. He accused her of sounding like his ex, of turning everything into a transaction. He said he thought she loved him for who he was, not for what he earned. That night, he packed a small bag and told her he needed space to think. Julia didn't stop him. She watched him close the door softly behind him, the sound more final than any slammed door could have been. Days turned into weeks, and Brian's messages grew fewer until they stopped altogether. Just like that, he was gone. No screaming, no betrayal, just a quiet retreat from a life that had become too heavy for him to carry. The emptiness that followed wasn't as sharp as it had been with Mark. There were no bruises, no panic-filled nights. This time, the pain was duller, more like a reminder than a wound. Julia missed the companionship, the easy laughter, the small gestures, but she didn't miss rearranging her dreams to accommodate someone else's inertia. She had done enough of that. In the months that followed, Julia threw herself into work and motherhood. The florist shop expanded. She learned to negotiate with suppliers, to design arrangements that customers raved about. Ethan started kindergarten, and their evenings were filled with stories and art projects instead of tense conversations about overdue bills. For the first time in years, Julia felt something close to peace. She began to understand that loneliness was not the same as emptiness, that her worth wasn't measured by whether a man chose to stay. She could stand on her own, and she would. The spring Julia turned 26. The shop that had once been a cramped corner inside someone else's business finally became her own. With a modest loan from her parents and years of saved tips, She rented a small storefront on the east side of Portland and painted its weathered walls a soft sage green. Bloom and Vine. The sign read, her dream in carved wood and fresh paint. At first, she worried no one would come. But word spread quickly about the florist, who remembered customers' anniversaries by heart and crafted bouquets that felt like stories. Within a year, she was supplying arrangements for weddings, hotels, and community events. Business thrived, and so did Julia. The girl who once hid bruises beneath long sleeves was now a business owner, a provider, a mother building something lasting from the rubble of her past. It was during this period of quiet growth that Scott Harper walked into her life. He first appeared at the shop one rainy afternoon, tall and well-dressed, looking for flowers for his sister's engagement party. He lingered after making his purchase, asking questions about the business, about Ethan, about Julia herself. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of man who seemed to light up a room just by entering it. He remembered small details, how she took her coffee, the book she was reading, and his attention felt like sunlight after a long winter. Julia, cautious after everything she had endured, tried to keep her distance. But Scott was patient, persistent, and slowly, carefully, he found his way into her heart. Their relationship unfolded quickly once she allowed it. Scott was affectionate, thoughtful, and seemingly invested, not just in her, but in Ethan too. He helped fix things around the shop, cooked dinner on nights she worked late, and told her she deserved to be cherished. For the first time, Julia let herself imagine a future with someone again, a partner to share the weight she had carried alone for so long. After 8 months of dating, Scott suggested they move in together. It felt like the natural next step. But soon after he unpacked his boxes and hung his clothes in her closet, subtle shifts began to appear. At first, they were small, harmless comments about how Ethan needed more discipline, or how Julia worked too much. Then the tone hardened. He started setting rules for the boy. No playing outside without asking him first. No cartoons before finishing homework. No visiting friends on weekdays. Ethan, confused and withdrawn, began spending more time in his room. When Julia protested, Scott brushed it off. "I'm just trying to help," he'd say, his voice smooth but final. "He needs a man's influence." The rules grew stricter, the criticism sharper. Scott questioned Julia's decisions constantly, from the way she ran her shop to the meals she cooked. "You're too soft," he'd mutter when she comforted Ethan after a scraped knee. "You're too emotional." One evening, after she challenged him about a particularly harsh punishment he'd given Ethan for spilling juice, Scott turned to her and said, almost casually, "You're just a woman, Julia. You should know your place." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking. That night, Julia lay awake long after Scott had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling with a hollow ache in her chest. It was as if every bruise, every insult from her past had come rushing back in his voice. She had promised herself she would never live in fear again. Not for herself, and certainly not for her son. By morning, the decision was made. When Scott came home from work that evening, his key no longer fit the lock. His clothes were packed in boxes by the door. Julia didn't yell or cry. She simply told him that this was over, that she would not raise Ethan in a home ruled by fear or control. Scott laughed bitterly, accused her of being ungrateful, of throwing away a good man. But Julia didn't waver. She closed the door behind him and leaned against it, trembling, her heart breaking even as relief washed through her. It hurt, God, it hurt, to watch another relationship collapse. But as Ethan slipped his small hand into hers and whispered, "Are we okay now, Mom?" Julia realized she had gained something far more precious than what she'd lost. She had reclaimed her home, and more importantly, she had shown her son, and herself, that love built on control wasn't love at all. It was a golden afternoon in late September, the kind Portland offered as summer surrendered to fall. The air was crisp, the sidewalks littered with the first scattered leaves. Julia had stayed late at the shop that day, finishing a large order for a downtown hotel, while her mother offered to take Ethan for a walk in the park. It was their routine. Ethan loved feeding the ducks by the pond, and her mother cherished those small, ordinary moments with her grandson. Julia kissed them both goodbye at the door, never imagining that kiss would be the last one she'd give her mother. She was cleaning up stray stems and wiping down the counter when the phone rang. At first, she ignored it, humming softly as she worked. But it rang again, insistent this time. When she answered, a stranger's trembling voice spilled words that didn't seem to belong together. "Accident, ambulance. Your son, please come quickly." The world tilted on its axis. Julia didn't remember locking the shop, didn't remember the drive, only the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears and the taste of copper in her mouth as she whispered Ethan's name over and over like a prayer. When she arrived at the intersection near the park, flashing lights painted the pavement red and blue. A small crowd had gathered, faces pale and hushed. Julia pushed through them, her legs barely obeying her, until she saw the crumpled stroller, the twisted bicycle frame, and then a blanket on the ground. Under it lay her mother, still and lifeless. A paramedic was kneeling beside Ethan, who wasn't moving. His face was ghostly pale, his small body limp as they placed him on a stretcher. Julia screamed his name, but he didn't respond. Someone grabbed her arm, a police officer, telling her she couldn't go closer, that they were trying to save him. She barely heard the words. All she could see was her boy's unmoving hand and the blood matting his hair. Then she saw the man in handcuffs, leaning against a patrol car, his face flushed and glassy-eyed. It took a moment for her brain to catch up with what her eyes already knew. Michael, her ex-husband, Ethan's father. He was shouting something slurred and incoherent, insisting it wasn't his fault, that they came out of nowhere. The officer beside him shook his head and said his blood alcohol level was over the legal limit, twice over. Julia's knees buckled. The man who had abandoned them years ago had now destroyed everything that remained. Her father arrived minutes later and collapsed to his knees beside her mother's body. The shock was too much. As Julia tried to steady him, his breathing grew ragged, his face ashen. Paramedics rushed to his side, calling out numbers and orders as they loaded him into another ambulance. Julia stood frozen between the two vehicles, one carrying the man who had broken her heart years ago, one carrying the man who had raised her, and one carrying the boy who was her whole world. At the hospital, time ceased to exist. Hours stretched and collapsed as doctors moved in and out of the operating room. Julia sat in the hallway outside surgery, still in her work clothes, hands stained with soil from the shop. She stared at the floor, unable to pray, unable to breathe. Her mother was gone. Her father was in critical care. And Ethan, her beautiful, bright Ethan, was somewhere behind those double doors, fighting for his life. A surgeon finally emerged, his expression grave. Ethan had survived the operation, but the damage was severe. A traumatic brain injury, spinal complications, a future no one could predict. "He may never walk again," the doctor said gently. Julia nodded, though the words barely penetrated the fog that surrounded her. When they finally let her into his room, she almost didn't recognize him. Tubes snaked from his small body, machines beeped steadily, and a bandage wrapped around his head. She sank into the chair beside his bed and took his hand, whispering stories about the ducks at the pond, about the flowers waiting for him back home, about how proud she was of him. Her tears soaked the blanket, but she didn't care. Somewhere beneath the crushing weight of grief, a flicker of resolve sparked. Julia had no idea how she would do it, no roadmap, no plan. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would fight for her son with every breath she had. Whatever it took, doctors, specialists, therapy, miracles, she would find a way. Ethan had always been her reason to keep going. Now he was her reason to never stop. The weeks that followed blurred into one another, a haze of antiseptic air, whispered prayers, and sleepless nights. Ethan remained in the pediatric rehabilitation unit, his small frame dwarfed by the machinery surrounding him. There were moments when his fingers twitched, when his eyelids fluttered as if he were trying to find his way back. But the doctor's words echoed in Julia's mind every time she dared to hope he may never walk again. Physical therapy sessions were grueling and yielded little progress. Each time Ethan tried to move his legs and failed, a piece of Julia's heart seemed to splinter. She spent hours talking to specialists, combing through research, and reading late into the night. Most offered little more than polite sympathy and tempered expectations. Focus on adapting your home, one advised gently. Make peace with the possibility that this is permanent. Julia nodded through the conversations, but inside she raged against them. Permanent was not an option, not for her boy. One afternoon, as she sat by Ethan's bed watching him sleep, she overheard two neurosurgeons talking outside the door. They spoke in hushed tones about Dr. Richard Hayes, a pioneer in neurorehabilitation who had achieved remarkable results with spinal trauma patients. He had retired years ago and disappeared from the public eye, retreating to a remote cabin in the Cascade Mountains. Most believed he no longer saw patients, but some whispered that he occasionally took on special cases. The name burned into Julia's thoughts. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, she scoured every article, interview, and medical journal she could find on Richard Hayes. His work was legendary, groundbreaking techniques that had given children like Ethan a second chance at walking. And then, abruptly, he had vanished from the field. No practice, no forwarding address, only a vague mention of a cabin in the Cascades. The next morning, Julia made her decision. She withdrew what little savings she had, packed a bag with essentials, and arranged for Ethan's physical therapy to continue as an outpatient until they returned. Friends and hospital staff tried to dissuade her. The journey was long, the location uncertain, the odds slim. But Julia's resolve was unshakable. She had spent too many nights staring at the ceiling, imagining her son trapped in a chair for the rest of his life. If there was even a fragment of hope in those mountains, she would find it. The trip was harder than she had imagined. The drive alone took nearly a day, winding deeper into forested roads where cell service vanished and gas stations became rare. She and Ethan stayed overnight in a small roadside inn before continuing at dawn. As the sun climbed over the pines, Julia followed directions scribbled from an old newspaper article, praying she hadn't made a terrible mistake. Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, his head resting against the window, eyes full of a patience that broke her heart. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing where a modest cabin stood, tucked between towering cedars. Julia's pulse quickened as she stepped out of the car and knocked on the weathered door. A tall man with graying hair and kind eyes answered. "I'm sorry," he said gently before she could speak. "My father passed away 2 years ago." The words hit her like a physical blow. All the miles, all the hope she'd clung to, gone in an instant. She felt her knees weaken as she tried to explain, her voice trembling as she spoke of Ethan, the accident, the desperate search for a miracle. The man listened silently, his gaze drifting toward the car where Ethan sat. After a long pause, he introduced himself, Dr. Lucas Hayes, Richard's son. He had followed in his father's footsteps, specializing in pediatric neurorehabilitation. "I'm not my father," he said softly, "but I've spent my life trying to learn from him. And if you're willing, I'd like to see if I can help your boy." Julia's breath caught. She hadn't expected kindness here, not after so many closed doors. She glanced back at Ethan, then at Lucas, and for the first time since that terrible day at the park, something other than fear bloomed in her chest. It was small and fragile, but it was real. It was hope. The cabin in the Cascades became their new world, a place where time slowed to the rhythm of the forest and healing was measured, not in days, but in the smallest movements. Dr. Lucas Hayes wasted no time after agreeing to help Ethan. He studied the boy's medical records, adjusted his brace, and designed a therapy plan unlike anything Julia had seen before. A blend of conventional rehabilitation and innovative techniques his father had pioneered. Mornings began with gentle exercises to retrain Ethan's muscles, followed by sensory stimulation drills meant to rebuild the connection between his body and brain. Afternoons were devoted to hydrotherapy in a heated pool behind the cabin, where the resistance of water allowed Ethan to move without pain. Progress was slow, agonizingly so. The first week brought no visible change. Ethan often cried from frustration, and Julia cried quietly in the kitchen when he couldn't see. But Lucas was unwavering. Healing isn't linear, he told them. It's a climb, not a sprint. He spoke to Ethan like an equal, never pitying him, never lowering expectations. And Ethan responded to that. Bit by bit, he pushed through the frustration. By the second month, his toes twitched when Lucas touched them. By the third, he could move one leg a few inches. The first time he stood with the help of parallel bars. Julia covered her mouth to muffle the sob that escaped her. Life in the mountains settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Julia cooked meals while Lucas and Ethan worked on exercises. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the tree line. Ethan curled up with a book while the adults talked long after the stars appeared. At first, the conversations were about therapy schedules and recovery milestones. Then, slowly, they shifted to music, to childhood memories, to wounds they had both carried for years. One night, as a fire crackled in the hearth and rain tapped gently on the roof, Lucas spoke about the reason he had left his city life behind. He had once been engaged to a woman named Jadwiga, brilliant, ambitious, someone he believed he would spend his life with. But betrayal had crept in quietly. She had fallen in love with another man, and Lucas discovered the affair only weeks before their wedding. "I thought I knew who I was," he admitted, staring into the flames. Then one lie unraveled everything. "I couldn't practice medicine in the same halls where I'd once planned a future with her, so I walked away." Julia listened in silence, understanding more than she let on. She told him about Mark, the violence, the fear, the night she ran barefoot into the dark. She spoke of the humiliation of begging landlords for extensions, of working 3 jobs, and still coming up short, of trying to explain to a little boy why his father didn't come home. Lucas didn't interrupt. He just reached across the table and took her hand, not as a gesture of comfort, but of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of shared scars. What began as companionship deepened into something neither had expected. They moved around each other with a quiet familiarity, finishing each other's sentences, reading thoughts in a glance. One morning, Julia found herself laughing, truly laughing, as Lucas and Ethan argued over how many pancakes were too many. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. And one evening, as the sun bled gold across the mountains, Lucas kissed her, gentle, hesitant, like a man relearning trust. By the 6th month, Ethan took his first steps with a pair of crutches. Julia wept openly, clutching him to her chest as Lucas looked on, his own eyes shining. The impossible had become possible. And yet, even as joy filled the cabin, Julia knew it was time. Ethan needed school, therapy, friends, a world bigger than the forest. Their life in the mountains had been a sanctuary, but it could not be forever. On their last night there, Julia stood with Lucas under a sky heavy with stars. "I have to take him back," she whispered. "He needs more than I can give him here." Lucas nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. "I know, but I'll be here, however long it takes." When they left the next morning, Ethan waving through the car window, the road ahead felt uncertain but alive with possibility. Julia glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin fading into the trees, and then at her son beside her, asleep and dreaming. Somewhere between heartbreak and hope, she had found something she never thought she'd have again. Love, fragile but real. And now, she carried it with her back into the world. Returning to Portland after months in the Cascades felt like stepping into a world that had been paused and was now waiting to resume. The city streets hummed with life. The shops smelled of fresh blooms again, and for the first time since the accident, Julia felt a quiet sense of stability. Ethan continued his therapy at a specialized rehabilitation center, and the progress he made astonished even the doctors. He learned to balance on his crutches, then to take cautious steps without them. Each milestone was celebrated with ice cream and laughter, each small victory a reminder of how far they had come. Life found a rhythm once more. Julia threw herself into work, expanding Bloom and Vine with new clients and floral workshops. Her evenings were filled with homework sessions and bedtime stories. The apartment was filled with warmth and noise, the kind of noise she used to dream about on lonely nights. Yet, even in the fullness of this new life, there were moments when her thoughts drifted back to the cabin, to quiet evenings beneath a canopy of stars, and to Lucas. They exchanged letters and calls, and though he never pressured her, Julia sensed that his feelings hadn't faded. Truthfully, neither had hers. One mild spring afternoon, Julia took Ethan to their favorite park. He walked beside her, still cautious but determined, his crutches swinging lightly with each step. They were sharing a bag of roasted almonds and talking about the ducks when a voice she hadn't heard in years sliced through the calm. "Julia!" She turned and felt her stomach tighten. Scott Harper was standing a few feet away, his smile thin and bitter. "You've been ignoring my calls," he said, stepping closer. Julia's pulse quickened. She hadn't spoken to him since the day she changed the locks. "There's nothing to say," she replied evenly, pulling Ethan closer. Scott's face darkened. "You think you're too good for me now? You think you can just erase me?" He grabbed her wrist before she could step back. The suddenness of it froze her, the pressure of his fingers, the familiar surge of fear she thought she'd buried. "Let me go," she said firmly, but he tightened his grip. Ethan shouted for him to stop, but Scott's anger only flared. "You owe me a chance," he hissed. Before Julia could react, another voice, deeper, steadier, cut through the tension. "She doesn't owe you anything." Scott turned, and his expression shifted from fury to shock. Lucas was striding across the grass, his eyes locked on Scott with a calm that was more dangerous than shouting. "Step away," Lucas warned. Scott scoffed, muttering something about meddling doctors, but the look in Lucas's eyes was enough to make him retreat a few steps. "If you ever touch her again," Lucas said quietly, "you'll regret it." Scott's bravado crumbled. Muttering under his breath, he turned and stalked away, disappearing into the thinning afternoon crowd. Julia stood frozen, her heart still racing, Ethan clinging to her side. Lucas approached slowly, concern softening his features. "Are you okay?" he asked, and she nodded, though her hands were trembling. How are you here?" she whispered. "I told you I'd wait," he said with a small smile. But waiting didn't mean staying away. They walked together through the park until Ethan grew tired and needed to rest. They sat on a bench beneath an old maple tree, and Lucas took Julia's hand. "I came back because I realized something," he said. "I don't want to build a life without you. Not in those mountains, not anywhere." Her breath caught as he dropped to one knee on the grass. "Julia Dawson," he said, his voice steady, "will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's face lit up with joy. "Say yes, Mom," he urged, his eyes shining. And she did. The word felt light and certain on her tongue, yes. Their wedding, held a few months later in a small garden behind the shop, was simple and perfect. Ethan walked beside Julia down the aisle, his steps sure and proud. Friends and family gathered beneath strings of fairy lights as vows were exchanged, tears were shed, and laughter rippled through the air. When Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, Julia knew she was no longer just surviving. She was living. And for the first time in a long time, their family was whole. For a while, it felt like everything Julia had ever dreamed of was finally within reach. Marriage brought with it a deep, steady happiness she had once believed was impossible. Bloom and Vine continued to thrive. Ethan's recovery exceeded every prognosis, and evenings were spent with the three of them cooking dinner together or reading by the fire. Lucas, too, seemed content, more grounded than he had been in years. Yet beneath that happiness, life was shifting in ways Julia couldn't see. It started with a phone call one gray November morning. Julia was arranging winter bouquets in the shop when Lucas walked in, his expression unreadable. "That was St. Mary's Medical Center," he said, naming one of Portland's most prestigious hospitals. "They want me to come back to head the neurology department." The news should have filled her with pride, and part of her was proud. Lucas had once been considered one of the brightest minds in his field before leaving it all behind. This was recognition of that brilliance, but another part of her felt uneasy. The hospital was in the same city where he and Jadwiga had lived, where everything between them had unraveled. Lucas brushed off her concerns. "That's the past," he said, kissing her forehead. "This is about the future, our future." And for a while it seemed like he was right. He threw himself into his new role with energy she hadn't seen in years. He came home tired but fulfilled, talking about new research projects and colleagues who respected his work. Julia listened and smiled, even as late nights at the hospital grew more frequent, even as his text messages became shorter and his kisses distracted. Then one evening, 3 months into his new position, Lucas came home later than usual. Julia was in the kitchen, helping Ethan with a school project, when she heard the door close softly. Something in the silence that followed made her turn. Lucas was standing there, still in his hospital coat, but he didn't step forward. He looked haunted. "We need to talk," he said quietly. The words that followed shattered her world. He told her that Jadwiga was back, that she had taken a position at the same hospital. They had seen each other by chance, and all the feelings he thought had died resurfaced. He confessed he had met her several times in recent weeks, and then, with his voice barely above a whisper, he admitted the truth. He had slept with her. Julia felt the room spin. The walls seemed to close in, the hum of the refrigerator too loud, Ethan's crayons too bright. "You're telling me this like it's some noble confession," she said, her voice trembling. "Like I should admire your honesty." Lucas's face crumpled. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. "I thought I was over her, but I'm not. I still love her." The words cut deeper than any betrayal before. Not just the act, but the admission that his heart had never fully been hers. The next morning, Lucas packed a suitcase. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He kissed Ethan's forehead, murmured something Julia didn't catch, and walked out of the apartment without looking back. The door closed with a quiet click, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped. Julia collapsed. She spent the next 2 days in bed, unable to eat, unable to speak. The life she had built, the fragile trust, the second chance, lay in ruins. Ethan crept into the room at night, curling against her side and whispering, "It's okay, Mom. We still have each other." His small hand in hers was the only thing that kept her from disappearing entirely. On the 3rd day, Claudia arrived without warning. She had been Julia's friend since college, the one who had helped her after Mark, who had watched Ethan when Julia couldn't afford childcare. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply opened the curtains, brewed coffee, and sat beside Julia in silence. When Julia finally spoke, a hoarse whisper of, "I don't know how to do this again," Claudia squeezed her hand. "You've done harder things," she said, "and you're not doing this alone." The words didn't erase the pain, but they planted a seed. Julia dragged herself out of bed that evening, showered, and ate her first meal since Lucas left. She wasn't okay, not even close, but she was still standing. And somewhere deep inside, buried beneath the devastation, a small, stubborn voice reminded her that she had survived heartbreak before. She could do it again. Life with Jadwiga didn't unfold the way Lucas had imagined. For a few weeks, The rekindled romance felt intoxicating. Familiar laughter, shared memories, the illusion that they could rewrite the past. But reality crept in quickly. Old arguments resurfaced. Trust never truly returned, and the cracks that had once broken them apart widened once more. Jadwiga was restless, ambitious, and never fully present. She spent long nights working late, left town for conferences without explanation, and avoided questions with practiced charm. 6 months after Lucas had walked out on Julia, he came home early from a hospital fundraiser and found Jadwiga in his apartment with another man. She didn't cry or beg for forgiveness. She simply shrugged and said, "It was never meant to be forever." The betrayal gutted him. The life he had thrown everything away for, his marriage, Ethan's trust, Julia's love, evaporated in a single evening. Jadwiga moved out within days, and Lucas was left alone in a sterile apartment filled with ghosts of choices he couldn't undo. He buried himself in work, volunteering for extra shifts and research projects, but nothing filled the hollow ache in his chest. Every hospital corridor reminded him of Julia's laughter. Every patient's small victory echoed Ethan's determination. Regret became his constant companion, a weight he carried everywhere. While Lucas's world unraveled, Julia was rebuilding hers piece by piece. In the months after the betrayal, she poured all her energy into Ethan and Bloom and Vine. The shop flourished under her care, expanding into 2 new locations and becoming a fixture in Portland's event scene. She started teaching floral design workshops and even hired women who, like her, were trying to rebuild their lives after hardship. The work gave her purpose and structure, a reason to get out of bed on the days grief threatened to pull her back under. Ethan continued to make remarkable progress. He still walked with a slight limp, but his confidence soared. He joined a local robotics club, made friends, and often came home bursting with stories about projects they were building. Watching him thrive reminded Julia of the strength they had both earned, not given, but fought for inch by inch. In the midst of this new chapter, a letter arrived from the State Corrections Department. Michael Dawson, the man who had destroyed so much with one reckless choice, had died in prison. The official cause was heart failure, but the words felt strangely hollow on the page. Julia sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it, the memories flooding back, the flashing lights, the blood on Ethan's hair, her father collapsing beside her mother's body. At his sentencing, she had told Michael through gritted teeth that she hoped he would live long enough to feel the weight of what he'd done. "You took everything from me," she had said, "and I hope the silence of that cell echoes louder every day." Now that chapter was over. She didn't feel joy, nor the righteous satisfaction she had once imagined. Just a deep, quiet release, as if a door that had been locked for years had finally creaked open. Michael's death couldn't undo the pain he'd caused, but it ended the story on her terms, not his. In time, Julia learned to forgive. Not Michael, not Lucas, but herself. She forgave the younger version of her who had stayed too long with a violent man, the woman who had believed she needed someone else to make her whole, the mother who had spent nights blaming herself for Ethan's suffering. Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly in small moments. Laughing with Ethan over burnt pancakes, signing the lease for her 3rd shop, realizing she could go days without thinking of Lucas. Lucas reached out a few times, emails she never answered, letters she never opened. She didn't hate him anymore, but she also didn't need him. The life she was building no longer had a place for someone who had walked away. On a quiet Sunday morning, Julia and Ethan visited her mother's grave. Ethan placed a bouquet of white lilies on the grass, his idea, and they stood together in silence. Julia felt the sun on her face and the steady beat of her son's heart beside her. The past had left its scars, but it had also forged something unbreakable. She was no longer a woman defined by betrayal and loss. She was Julia Dawson, mother, survivor, builder of a life that was entirely her own. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. 3 years passed, and time, that once merciless tide that had swept Julia from one heartbreak to another, finally became an ally. The wounds had long since scabbed over, leaving behind faint scars that no longer throbbed when touched. Life settled into a rhythm, both ordinary and extraordinary. The shop she had started with nothing but borrowed money and trembling hands had grown into a thriving business with 3 locations across Portland. Julia became known as the florist who remembered every story behind every bouquet. A businesswoman respected not just for her talent, but for her resilience. At home, Ethan had blossomed into a vibrant, determined young boy. His limp was barely noticeable now, a slight sway that only those who knew his story would recognize. He ran with his friends at the park, climbed trees, and raced his robotics projects across the living room floor. Every laugh, every unsteady step that became a confident stride was a victory Julia never stopped celebrating. Their small apartment was filled with warmth, the smell of fresh bread on Sundays, the clutter of school projects on the kitchen table, the soft hum of music drifting through the evenings. Lucas was little more than a distant memory now, a ghost who occasionally surfaced in whispers from mutual acquaintances. After Jadwiga left him, he had thrown himself deeper into his work, earning accolades and publishing research. But none of it filled the void he had carved in his own life. He lived alone in a sleek apartment overlooking the city, surrounded by the trappings of success, but haunted by the family he had let slip through his fingers. People said he often paused in front of Bloom and Vine's flagship shop on his walks home from the hospital, watching through the window as Julia arranged flowers or helped Ethan with his homework. But he never went inside. He knew some distances could not be crossed twice. Julia sometimes thought about him, not with anger anymore, not even with sadness, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what could never be again. Love, she had learned, was not just about how someone made you feel. It was about how they showed up when everything was on the line. And Lucas, for all his brilliance and tenderness, had chosen to leave. That choice defined him more than any apology could erase. Her life was full now, richer and more complete than she ever thought possible in the dark days after the accident. She hosted community workshops in her shop, teaching others how to find beauty in simple things. She spoke at women's shelters about resilience, about how survival wasn't just about enduring, but about rebuilding, piece by piece, until the life you created was stronger than the one that broke. And on quiet evenings, when the city lights flickered against the windows and Ethan's laughter echoed down the hallway, Julia would curl up on the couch with a cup of tea and marvel at how far they had come. There were no fairy tales here, no sweeping romantic reunions or dramatic declarations. Just a woman and her son, standing tall in a life they had built from ashes. A woman who had been beaten, betrayed, abandoned, and who had still risen, stronger than before. Sometimes betrayal takes everything. The people you love, the future you imagined, the version of yourself you once believed in. But it cannot destroy the will to rise again. Julia Dawson had learned that truth the hardest way possible. And as she locked up her shop one crisp autumn night, Ethan running ahead of her on legs once deemed useless, she smiled. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer defined her. The road behind her was littered with heartbreak. The road ahead was hers alone, wide open, waiting and free.
The world keeps turning, and with each turn comes a new story. When one door closes, another opens, leading us into a journey entirely different. Let us set aside the echoes of the tale just past and step together into a new realm where another destiny awaits to be told. And now I invite you to listen to the second story, a path of its own, unrelated to what came before, yet filled with mysteries and surprises meant only for those willing to journey onward with me.
I never believed silence could be so loud until I sat there in the back seat of that cab, staring at the woman beside me, realizing she was describing my husband. Not just vaguely, not just kind of. She was telling me, without knowing it, that the man waiting for her at that beautiful lakeside cabin was my husband, Gregory. and I still had 30 miles to go. Just that morning, I had woken up to sunlight streaming through the curtains, my heart light, my mind humming with anticipation. Gregory had gone up to our retreat in Lakewood on Wednesday, said he needed quiet to finish drafting the plans for his next interior design project. "I just need space," Ellie, he had told me over the phone, his voice tender. "You know how the noise clutters my process." I'd laughed and agreed like I always did. That's the kind of wife I was, supportive, understanding, never questioning. Friday was a half day at the office, and as I walked out early with my coworkers waving behind me, I made a decision that felt spontaneous and sweet. I'd surprise him. We hadn't had a real weekend together in weeks, and I missed him. The idea of cooking dinner together, watching the lake shimmer at sunset, maybe even opening that bottle of Bordeaux we'd been saving. It gave me a rush I hadn't felt in a while. I drove home humming, packed my favorite cardigan, a flowy sundress, and, because I felt a little bold, the lingerie he had given me last Valentine's, just in case this turned into a weekend of reconnection. And then my car wouldn't start. I tried once, twice. The engine clicked, sputtered, then gave up. I sat there for a moment, fists clenched on the steering wheel, trying not to scream. Of course, of all days, I could have waited for the mechanic. I could have rescheduled, but I was determined. I didn't want to waste any more time. So I called for a taxi. Pricey for the distance, sure, but worth it. Or so I thought. The driver was an older man named George. Warm smile, gentle manners, and a slow southern drawl that made everything sound calm. We'd barely gotten 10 miles out of Charleston when he stopped to pick someone else up, said it was a shared ride request. I didn't mind. The more the merrier, I thought. Then she stepped in. She was striking, not just in the way that turned heads, but in the way that said she knew she turned heads. Auburn hair twisted into a perfect low bun, delicate makeup, a scent that was expensive and deliberate. Her name was Samantha. She smiled at me as she slid into the back seat, and I returned it, instinctively brushing my hand over my ponytail, suddenly hyper-aware of the slight smudge in my eyeliner. The ride started quiet enough. George played soft music. Samantha scrolled through her phone. I watched the trees go by, breathing in that rare sense of peace that comes from escaping the city. We were maybe 20 minutes in when she broke the silence. "I'm meeting someone," she said, unprompted, her voice light. "It's been a few weeks since we've seen each other. He's special." I smiled politely, murmured something vague. She took it as a green light. "He's older, talented, an interior designer, actually," she said, chuckling softly. "He's got this incredible mind. Everything has to be just right for him to work. That's why he goes out to this cabin. Says the city stifles his creativity." My body stiffened. "It's our spot," she continued, a dreamy look in her eyes. "He's even showing me his new project this weekend. Said he has a surprise for me." My lips parted, but no sound came out. "I'm a little nervous," she admitted, then laughed. "It's silly, right? I mean, we've been seeing each other for 6 months. But I think this weekend something big might happen." My lungs started to feel tight. The edges of the world blurred a little. Then she said it, just a name, casually. "Gregory." And the world stopped. My husband's name falling from the mouth of a stranger, like it belonged to her. I turned toward the window, pretending to admire the view. But inside I was screaming. I hadn't said a word about who I was. She didn't know me. She didn't know she had just shattered something sacred. And I didn't stop her, because something inside me, something cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear, needed to hear more. And I knew I would. Samantha didn't notice the shift in me. Or maybe she did, but mistook it for polite interest. Either way, she kept talking and I kept listening. Each word was like a thread unraveling the fabric of my marriage. "You know what I love about him," she said, twirling a strand of her hair. "He always remembers the little things. Like how I adore white roses. And he doesn't just grab any bunch, he picks out the ones with long stems, the kind that look elegant in tall glass vases. White roses. Gregory used to bring them home for me. Every single anniversary. He said they reminded him of my quiet strength, of the way I held things together. I always thought that was the most beautiful thing he'd ever said to me. Samantha reached up, touched the dainty silver earrings hanging from her lobes. He gave me these last week, she said proudly. Said they brought out the gray in my eyes. I mean, who notices something like that? Gregory noticed. He'd said the same thing to me about different earrings. For a moment, I almost laughed. Almost. Because the absurdity of it all, this recycled poetry he was spoon-feeding both of us, was just so pathetic. But laughter never came. Only a bitter twist deep in my chest. I still said nothing. I think she took my silence as encouragement. Or maybe she just didn't care. We met at a cafe, she continued, shifting in her seat. He was sketching something, plans, I think, and I accidentally knocked over a sugar jar. Total mess. He helped me clean it up, and then, out of nowhere, offered to buy me a coffee to make up for it. She giggled. Who does that anymore? I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her I had heard that story before, down to the spilled sugar. Only back then the woman he helped was me. My grip on the seat tightened. George, still driving, turned up the radio slightly. Some soft country song drifted through the car. It would have been peaceful under any other circumstance. Gregory is different, she went on. He doesn't talk like other guys. He actually listens. He tells me about his work, how spaces should breathe, how colors affect mood. And I get it, you know? It's not just a job for him. It's art. I could see the way her face lit up when she spoke. She was in love. Completely. Blindly. And suddenly I didn't hate her. How could I? She was holding on to the same illusion I once had. Only difference was I was further down the line. What does he do exactly? I asked, finally speaking. My voice sounded strange, detached. He's an interior designer, she answered. But he says labels don't matter. He just creates. She laughed. Apparently, the cabin is where he thinks best. Has a studio out there and everything. Of course he does. We built it together. I picked out the beams. I helped stain the floor. But I just nodded. He told me he's married, she said suddenly, her tone shifting ever so slightly. But it's complicated. He says she's difficult, controlling, always criticizing him. He said he's staying for now because she's emotionally fragile. Emotionally fragile. I had held him through panic attacks. I had stayed up nights to make sure he got through deadline weeks. I had given him space when he asked and attention when he needed it. I wasn't fragile. I was exhausted. There's a difference. I turned back to the window. The sky was beginning to darken. Storm clouds gathering. He's planning to leave her, Samantha added, almost as if she needed me to approve. He just wants to do it in a way that won't break her. Break me? I was already broken. Only I hadn't realized it until now. She started talking about their plans, dinners at a restaurant in the city, the one with the fountain view. That had been our place. I spent my last birthday there. I still had the candle from the cake. He had brought her there too. I couldn't breathe. My stomach turned. My mouth tasted like metal. And still I said nothing, because something in me had already shifted. Something calm, calculating, steady. I wasn't going to cry in a taxi. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't even going to tell her who I was. Not yet, because I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to watch the ending. I don't remember exactly when it stopped feeling like a car ride and started feeling like a slow-motion disaster. Somewhere between the moment she said his name and the moment she started talking about the scar on his arm, I lost track of time. He has this scar, Samantha said, smiling softly. Right here. She traced her right forearm with one perfectly manicured finger. From a bike accident when he was a kid. He said he flew over the handlebars and landed on gravel. Had to get stitches. Can you imagine? I could. I had. I'd kissed that scar more times than I could count. Gregory had told me the same story, how he'd refused to cry, how he'd gotten ice cream on the way home, how that scar reminded him to be careful with what he loved. We used to joke that it made him look rugged. I used to touch it absent-mindedly when we sat on the couch watching TV. And now it belonged to someone else's version of him. I stayed silent because I didn't trust my voice not to tremble. Samantha kept going. He says he wants to show me where he grew up, that it shaped how he sees the world. Isn't that romantic? She asked, not waiting for an answer. Oh, and next month, we're thinking of taking a trip together. Prague, maybe. He said the architecture there inspires him. Prague. Last winter, Gregory had told me he might be sent to Europe for a design expo. He said it'd be boring and business-focused, and that I shouldn't bother coming. I remember offering to take vacation time to go with him. He'd kissed my forehead and said, "You'd hate it." So he hadn't gone alone. And all this time, I thought we were just drifting because of work, because we were tired, because we were aging. No, it was because I had become invisible. Outside, the trees blurred by gray-green smudges. Rain tapped the windows gently. A storm was definitely coming. He told me, Samantha said casually, that his wife can't have kids, which is probably for the best. He says it's a sad situation, but she's kind of unstable, like emotional all the time. Honestly, I think he feels guilty. That's why he's stuck. Unstable. Gregory and I had been trying to conceive for 2 years. It had been exhausting and emotional. And yes, I'd cried. A lot. After every failed test, every doctor's visit, every round of hopeful vitamins. But I was never unstable. I was hopeful. And now I knew he'd turned that vulnerability into a weapon. Used it as his excuse. Painted me as a villain in someone else's fairy tale. Samantha touched her lips with a tissue, freshening her lipstick. Bright red. The color of confidence, of seduction. We're celebrating our 6-month anniversary this weekend, she said brightly. He said he's got something planned. Maybe even a ring. He asked for my ring size last week. My heart slammed against my ribs. Gregory had asked for my ring size too last month. Said he wanted to get me something special for our upcoming anniversary. I thought maybe he was trying. Maybe we were turning a corner. I thought wrong. And then she said something that made the breath freeze in my throat. He said he's never felt so free with anyone, that he's finally able to breathe, that I make him feel like a man again. My eyes stung. I blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. Breathe. That was our word. He used to say it every time I got overwhelmed. Just breathe, Ellie. He'd whisper it against my temple, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. Now he whispered it to her. I didn't even realize the cab had slowed until George leaned over the seat and muttered, "Sorry, folks. Looks like we've got a pile-up ahead. Might be a bit of a wait." Fine by me, because I needed the time. I needed to collect every shard of what I'd just heard, stack them neatly and build something out of them. Not revenge. Not rage. Clarity. I sat back, closed my eyes, and listened to the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof. Samantha was still chatting, oblivious, excited, glowing. She had no idea. Not yet. But soon. She would. The storm was in full swing by the time we reached the turnoff toward Lakewood. The sky hung low and bruised, rain lashing sideways against the windshield. George squinted into the blur, wipers thumping steadily. I sat still, heart pounding louder than the thunder overhead. Samantha, meanwhile, was fixing her hair in a compact mirror. She looked radiant, blissfully unaware. She reapplied her lipstick, smoothed her dress, and then gave a little squeal. "There he is," she said, pointing through the window. "He said he'd be waiting by the gate." I followed her gaze, and there he was, Gregory, wearing the blue flannel shirt I'd given him last Christmas, the one I said brought out the green in his eyes. He was standing in front of our gate, the exact gate I had painted myself 2 summers ago. And he was smiling, the smile I once believed was reserved for me. I shrank into my seat, praying the fogged glass would shield me. George pulled over, slowing to a stop near the curb. "This is me," Samantha chirped. She turned to me with a bright smile. "Thanks for the company. Have a lovely weekend." My lips barely moved. "You too." She opened the door, stepped out, and Gregory walked toward her like a man stepping into a dream. I watched, frozen, as he wrapped his arms around her, pulled her in close, and kissed her. Deeply, intimately. I looked away, but the sound, his voice, still reached me through the rain. "I missed you, sweetheart." Sweetheart. He used to call me that. Something broke then. Not loudly, not with fire, quietly, like a candle snuffed out without warning. George looked back over his shoulder. "Where to next, ma'am?" My mouth opened, but no words came. I could leave, right now. I could let that be the last image I ever had of Gregory Whitaker, my husband, holding another woman in the rain, on the porch of the home we built together. But then I heard it again. Samantha's laugh. Bright, confident, victorious. Something inside me shifted. "Take me back to the city," I said quietly. "My plans changed." George blinked. "You sure? Bit of a drive in this weather." "Yes," I nodded. "Please." As the car pulled away, I stared out the window. But the road blurred, not from the rain, but from something burning behind my eyes. I lasted all of 3 miles. "Stop the car," I said suddenly. George glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right?" "No," I said, "but I'm going back anyway." He made a U-turn on the narrow road without question. No comments, no judgment, just the hum of the engine and the soft patter of rain. When we reached the house again, the gate was slightly ajar. I paid George double, told him he wouldn't need to wait. He gave me a knowing look and nodded before driving off. There I stood, on the gravel drive in the soft drizzle, staring at the house I once called ours. I could hear laughter from inside. Gregory's voice, then Samantha's. They sounded comfortable, familiar, like they belonged there. I walked up to the front door and paused. My hand hovered above the knob. I could storm in, throw accusations, demand explanations, but I didn't want a scene. I wanted clarity. So I smoothed my hair, straightened my coat, and rang the doorbell. Footsteps, then the sound of the latch turning. Gregory opened the door, and his face turned the color of ash. "Eleanor," he whispered. "WH, what are you doing here?" I smiled. Surprise. Got off work early. Thought I'd come spend the weekend with my husband. He blinked. Panic bloomed in his eyes. You never said." "No," I cut in gently. "I didn't." A voice came from behind him. "Who is it?" Samantha stepped into view, brushing a loose curl behind her ear. Her expression froze the moment she saw me. She looked from me to Gregory, then back again. I extended a hand toward her, calm and composed. "Hi, I'm Eleanor, Gregory's wife." She didn't take my hand. She didn't have to, because in that moment, everything fell into place. The earrings, the roses, the stories, the lies. The truth stood between us, thick as smoke. Gregory's mouth opened, but no words came. And I stepped inside anyway, because it was still my house. And I wasn't done yet. Not even close. The house smelled like rosemary and bergamot, the scent of the candle I'd left on the windowsill last time I was here. The scent I thought of as home. Except now it didn't feel like mine. Gregory stood frozen in the doorway, as if unsure whether to step aside or slam the door in my face. I walked past him anyway, hanging my coat on the same wooden hook I'd installed by the door 3 years ago. Samantha trailed behind me, silent, her heels tapping lightly against the hardwood floor. The living room was exactly as I'd left it, the same blue, throw folded on the couch. The coffee table I refinished myself. 2 cups of tea sat steaming on it, and a small plate of lemon cookies, my favorite recipe. My stomach turned. "So cozy," I said softly, running my fingers along the mantel. "Looks like you've made yourselves at home." No one replied. I turned and smiled. Well, I suppose it would be rude of me not to offer my guests something to drink. Gregory opened his mouth, closed it again. Samantha stared at me as if I were a ghost. "Sit," I said gently, gesturing to the couch. "Please, it's raining. No sense in sending anyone back out right away." They obeyed. I walked into the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once spent an entire weekend painting the cabinets pale sage. My hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, finding the good mugs, slicing the cheese, arranging the charcuterie. All the things I used to do when Gregory had clients over. But this time the performance had a different audience. When I returned, I placed everything on the table with quiet grace. Gregory sat stiff as stone. Samantha's lipstick had faded slightly. Her hands trembled as she reached for her tea. "So," I said, taking my seat across from them, "how did you two meet?" Samantha blinked. Cafe," Gregory muttered, not looking at me. I nodded. "The sugar jar story. Classic." He flinched. Samantha set her cup down too quickly. Tea sloshed over the edge. She didn't notice. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. "Do you love him?" I asked. Samantha's eyes widened. I thought I did." "Do you still?" She looked at Gregory, then back at me. "I don't know." Silence stretched. "Eleanor," Gregory began, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I'm not here to scream or beg or ask why. I already know the why. Because you're weak, Gregory. Because you're selfish. Because you wanted something new instead of fixing what you already had." His face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Smart man for once. I turned to Samantha. "You know, he said the exact same things to me?" I said softly that he'd never felt more free, that he could breathe around me, that I made him feel like a man. Her lips parted. She didn't speak. I believed him too. We sat there like that. 3 people, 1 lie, too many truths, until finally I rose to my feet and walked to the fireplace. From the mantel, I picked up the silver picture frame. Our wedding photo. Me in ivory lace, him in a navy suit. Both of us laughing. I turned it around and set it face down. "I think we're done here," I said. Samantha stood slowly, her eyes downcast. "I didn't know." "I swear." "I believe you." She swallowed. "I should go." "No," I said, surprising even myself. "You'll stay the night. It's late, the roads are slick, and I wouldn't send a stranger out into this storm, even one who kissed my husband." Samantha looked like she might cry. Gregory looked like he already had. "Guest rooms upstairs, last door on the right. There's fresh towels in the closet." She nodded, murmured a thank you, and disappeared up the stairs. Gregory turned to me, shoulders sagging. "Ellie, I held up my hand again. "No more. You've said enough." I picked up my cup, took a long sip, and let the silence do the talking. Because in this house, in this moment, I was the one in control. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry. Not even because I was sad. I lay awake in the guest bedroom, my bedroom, listening to the creaks of the house I had once cherished. The occasional groan of old wood in the wind. The whisper of rain still sliding down the windows. And above it all, silence from the room down the hall. I imagined Samantha curled beneath the covers in what used to be the kids' room. We had painted it soft yellow years ago when we thought we'd fill it with cribs and lullabies. Now it sheltered the woman who almost stole my life away, though really she didn't even know it. Sometime before dawn I got up. The house was still. I padded barefoot into the kitchen, started a pot of coffee, and stared at the window while the machine hissed and gurgled. Outside, the sky was turning from black to charcoal, the first hints of morning softening the dark edges of the woods. Footsteps on the stairs made me turn. Samantha stood there, pale, hair loose, her mascara faintly smudged. She looked like someone who had aged a year overnight. "Can I sit?" she asked, voice hoarse. I nodded. She eased into a chair at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of an empty mug. "I didn't sleep," she said. "Me neither." Silence hung between us. Not hostile, not awkward, just heavy, like wet wool draped over both our shoulders. "How long did you know?" she asked. "Since the taxi." She blinked. "All that time, and you didn't say anything?" I poured coffee into 2 mugs and slid one across to her. I needed to see it for myself. She stared at the swirling liquid. "Why didn't you scream? Throw me out." I sat down. "Because I'm tired of screaming. And you didn't betray me, Samantha." "He did." She looked at me, eyes glassy. "I didn't know. He said you were cruel, controlling, that you'd ruin his life if he left." I gave a dry laugh. "Of course he did. That's what cowards do. They turn the truth into a prison and hand the key to someone else." "I feel stupid." "You're not." But I believed him. So did I. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug and stared at her reflection in the coffee. "I thought I was saving someone. Turns out I was just another version of the problem he didn't want to solve." The kettle whistled from the stovetop. I ignored it. "You know what the worst part is?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never told me about you. Not really. No photos. No stories. Just hints. Like I was supposed to imagine you as the villain." I stood and opened the cupboard above her, pulled out a photo album, set it on the table. "Here," I said. "This is the woman he was married to for 5 years." She flipped it open hesitantly. Page after page of memories. Christmases, vacations, the cabin under construction, smiling faces, entangled fingers, the illusion of forever. She paused on a picture of Gregory, kissing my cheek on our anniversary. I remembered that day because I had been sick, but still made him dinner. He told me it was the best meal he'd ever had. She turned the page and stopped. "That's the restaurant," she whispered. "The one with the fountain." "Our place," I said quietly. Tears filled her eyes. She closed the book slowly. "I'm sorry." "I know." A pause. "What will you do now?" "I'll drive you home." She looked surprised. "You don't have to." "I want to." I went upstairs, changed into jeans and a sweater, and grabbed the car keys from the bowl near the door. Gregory was still asleep when we left, or pretending to be. I didn't care. We drove in silence for the first few miles. Samantha stared out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When we reached the highway, she finally spoke. "Thank you for not hating me." "I don't hate you." "Still, you didn't have to be kind." I glanced at her, then back at the road. We were both lied to. That makes us the same kind of woman, just at different stages. She nodded. We didn't say much after that, but something unspoken passed between us in the quiet. Not forgiveness exactly. Something better. Recognition. After I dropped Samantha off, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove around the city aimlessly for nearly an hour, through neighborhoods I hadn't visited in years, past coffee shops where Gregory and I used to sit on Sunday mornings, past the hospital where we once hoped for answers about why we hadn't gotten pregnant. The streets looked the same, but I didn't. I wasn't the woman who had left for the lake cabin the day before. That woman was gone. When I finally walked through the door of our condo, everything felt quieter than usual, but not in a sad way. More like the calm after a storm that had torn through and cleared out everything false, everything heavy, everything that no longer belonged. Gregory came home that evening. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, his eyes wide when he saw the suitcase sitting neatly by the bedroom door. "Ellie," he said, his voice cautious, "can we talk?" I didn't look up from the mug I was rinsing. There's nothing left to say. I was stupid, he started. I lost myself. You didn't lose yourself, I said quietly. You just chose a version of yourself that didn't include me. I never stopped loving you. I turned off the faucet. Don't lie. You might have loved the idea of me, the loyalty, the comfort, but you haven't loved me, not the real me, for a long time. He stepped closer. We can fix this. I shook my head. No, you broke something that doesn't go back together. He looked around, as if trying to find something familiar to hold on to. This place, the cabin, everything we built, stays with me, I interrupted. I bought the condo before we married. The cabin deed is in my name. You can take the car. He blinked. You've already decided. I filed this morning, I said. Mutual consent. If you don't fight it, we'll be done in 2 months. He sat down, suddenly looking old. Tired. Small. I didn't hate him, but I didn't feel sorry for him either. Gregory was never evil. He was just weak. And I had spent too long loving a man who needed admiration more than honesty. By the end of the week, he was gone. I packed the rest of his things with care. No yelling. No slamming doors. Just quiet decisions. I changed the sheets. Repainted the bathroom. Got a new plant for the windowsill. And then I went back to the cabin. Alone. I stood in the middle of that beautiful house I had helped design. Every piece of furniture, every photo, every book on the shelf, and realized I didn't have to burn it all down to reclaim it. I just had to start over. So I did. I hired a contractor to knock down the wall between the kitchen and the living room. Made the space open, bright. I turned the guest room into an art studio. I didn't know if I was any good at painting, but it didn't matter. For the first time, I was creating something just for me. 3 months passed. One crisp autumn afternoon, I was sitting in a little cafe near the waterfront, sketchbook open, lost in thought, when a familiar voice called my name. I looked up. It was Samantha. She looked different, lighter, confident. Her hair was shorter. She wore less makeup. And next to her sat a man, early 30s, scruffy beard, kind eyes, who looked at her like she was the center of the universe. Eleanor, she smiled. I hoped I might see you again. We hugged like old friends. She introduced her boyfriend, Ben, and I introduced myself simply as Ellie. Samantha didn't bring up Gregory. She didn't need to, but as they were about to leave, she turned back and said, "Thank you for everything." I nodded. You deserve someone who doesn't need to lie to feel loved. She smiled. So do you. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. Eleanor? It's Henry. Gregory's old friend. We met once at that holiday party. I remembered. He'd always been kind. Funny. The kind of man who made you feel like you mattered when he spoke to you. I heard about everything he said. I'm sorry. He messed up. He did. A pause. I was wondering, would you have dinner with me sometime? Just 2 old acquaintances getting reacquainted. I laughed softly. That depends. Are you the kind of man who tells the truth? Always, he said. Even when it's hard. Then yes. After I hung up, I stood by the window of my condo, my space, my light, my silence, and watched the sky fade from pink to gray. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Not because I had ruined Gregory, but because I had chosen myself. I had let go of the illusion of who we were supposed to be and embraced the reality of who I was becoming. And that, I realized, was the greatest revenge of all. Living well. On my terms. In my own story.